Anything that gets in between two people being able to get married such that they can look after each other and have a rational passion for each other's well-being such that they don't end up on social services. Anything that inhibits a family's ability to take care of their children and creates so much economic stress that they're more likely than not to end up in a single-parent home. Any thoughts around this notion of love or empathy being a touchstone for a political movement?
What you just outlined is a conservative, small c, and not Republican, and certainly not MAGA Republican, but a conservative...
Rockefeller Republican.
Mm-hmm. That's right. Eisenhower Republican. What you just outlined in this modern world sounds radical. It sounds like a radical left position. Quite literally, the policies that you are outlining, and which now would be called wildly progressive, were in fact Eisenhower values. And he was a Republican.
Professor Richardson, where does this podcast find you?
I am in Mid-Coast, Maine, much hotter than I have been in the last 9 months up here.
Let's bust right into it here. How has patriotism been redefined in recent years, and what would it look like to reclaim it in service of democracy rather than authoritarianism?
Well, the second half of that is easy, but let's start with the first half of it. You know, one of the things that the Republicans did pretty effectively, really starting in the 1950s with the scare about communism, but certainly after the 1960s and the 1970s, was to identify membership in the Republican Party as being the heart of patriotism. And you really see this taking off under Nixon and Spiro Agnew when they deliberately polarized the country. They called it positive polarization, meaning that it was positive for them because people would vote Republican. And you see it really taking off under Ronald Reagan and his construction of the other, people like welfare queens. And once you got into talk radio in the mid-'80s and then into the Fox News channel, the deliberate division of the country into two groups, one assumed to be pro-America and the other assumed to be anti-American. And, that picked up a lot of themes like the fight against the Vietnam War and so on. But that idea that patriotism belongs to a certain party has turned out to be, really quite poisonous. And you see now the elevation of partisanship over country, even in things as recently as the budget reconciliation bill. So there's a perversion of patriotism that we see going on around us. But reclaiming a broader patriotism that shows an allegiance to the country rather than to a political party, we've done that repeatedly in the past, and the answer to that is simply to return to the foundational principles of the American democracy, the idea that we should be treated equally before the law, we have a right to a say in our government, and we have a right to equal access to resources. Those aren't difficult concepts, and they're the ones that have managed to create broad-based political movements throughout our history.
What do you think Americans get wrong about how authoritarian regimes come into power? And what other moment in history would you most equate this one to in terms of a rise of authoritarianism? Hitler was democratically elected, no?
Yes, but a key part of this is that those authoritarians never have a majority of the population. They are able to use the systems in order to turn a very small minority into a governing body. So, and I think we're seeing the same thing around us now. And what looks like this in the past to me is one of two things. Either the 1850s and the ability of a few elite slave owners to monopolize the political system to take over the government in their own interest, or the 1890s when we saw something very similar among the giant industrialists. And that, in a way, makes it easier to see ways to get out of it.
I often draw parallels between America now and 1930s Germany. Do you think that's a fitting comparison? Both the examples you gave were from American history.
Well, remember, I'm an Americanist. So, I can speak with authority on America. Any other country that I talk about is ill-informed. What historians do is we understand our body of work. And what I do is America. And my background is only partly in history. My master's is in literature. My degree is in American civilization. So I've been trained in a very different way than a historian who could do comparative history, for example. So yeah, I can read the same books that Germanists read, but I don't have the theoretical background to speak authoritatively about them. What I can do is look at people like Hannah Arendt and Erich Hoffer and George Orwell and all those people who looked at the moment after the rise of Mussolini and Hitler and made broad generalizations about the kinds of populations that are susceptible to a rising authoritarian. And, that's really your field, that idea of how do you market and to what population do you market? The idea of giving up your rights and your privileges in order to support one guy.
So funny, because just as you said that, I was immediately very self-conscious about Dunning-Kruger, and that is because I've had some success in some areas. I feel it gives me license to speak about things I don't know that much about, and I very much appreciate how measured you are in acknowledging that you're not an expert in certain fields and somewhat remiss to speak about it, and that is so rare in today's age. So I do appreciate that, and I think it represents one of the wonderful things about academia, that is a standard in academia, that you are supposed to stay in your own lane. So look, I'd be curious from an American viewpoint, or based on your background and domain expertise, I'll flip the question back to you. Who do you think has done the best job of marketing political parties? Or let me frame it this way. I think the Democratic Party right now, my understanding is if the election were held today, that Trump would still win handily over Vice President Harris, and that the Democratic Party is less popular right now than Trump or the Republican Party. And I would argue that a lot of that is marketing, that the Democratic Party is seen primarily as weak, as a party of identity politics, and a party that doesn't really understand how to improve the material and psychological well-being of ordinary Americans. But I'd love to get your view of what parties and why have been successful at marketing their own brand of politics.
Start with what you just said about the Democrats, because I don't disagree with you about the way that Democrats are perceived, but that's in part because defining the Democrats has been the business of the Republican Party. And that's through a media system that elevates the Republican voices through a construction of a certain kind of politics on the Republican side. They have managed to define their opponents in ways that are completely inaccurate, and the Democrats, I think, have not been able to push back against that successfully. Now, you started by asking who has successfully marketed the kind of political positions or the political parties in our history, and one of those groups is today's modern Republican Party, who since at least the 1980s has billed itself as a party that's going to dramatically increase economic growth and enable all boats to rise. Remember Reagan talking about the fact that by cutting taxes and cutting regulations, there would be such investment in the economy that it would enable everybody to do better, and we would be able to have increasing services, not less services, but increasing services because of the increase in tax revenue. That quite literally never paid off. And you're still seeing it again with the budget reconciliation bill of just a week ago, where, you had Trump out there saying this is going to cause such extraordinary growth. It doesn't. That simply does not work. But I think they were able to sell it in part by tapping into an extraordinarily powerful mythology, and a mythology that is not only part of American history, but part of sort of human literature. And that was the idea of the little guy fighting back against the empire. And that idea that Ronald Reagan pushed so effectively in 1980, in his campaign in 1980, but certainly people had been doing from before Reagan. You could go back to Barry Goldwater and back to William F. Buckley Jr. and back even, into the years before the New Deal, into fundamentalist Christianity, for example, and into all these different roots in the United States. That idea of the individual fighting back against the empire is a powerful enough myth that if you think about it, in 1977, it was the heart of Star Wars. And that idea of the cowboy and the independent individual and so on, that's something that a lot of Americans believed that they embodied. And I think one of the things that I just had to walk over here. Like I say, I really am on Mid-Coast Maine, and I don't have cell coverage or cable at my house. So somebody lends me this place to work from. And I was walking over here and I was thinking, we're seeing this now play out, where a lot of people who believed that they didn't need the government, they didn't need taxes, they could do it all on their own, are watching all the pieces of the government on which they depended being slashed and suddenly reaching a reckoning. And one of the things that to me is intellectually interesting is what happens when people recognize that, in fact, they do need a community. They do need each other. Well, in the past, what we've gotten is the kind of cultural moment where you celebrate buddy movies or community movies. During World War II, Hollywood made 0 Westerns, and they made all those sort of world, war II buddy movies or platoon movies and other things that celebrated towns and loyalties to each other. Maybe we get a moment like that. Maybe we get a lot of people who withdraw from politics. Maybe we get an extraordinarily angry reactionary politics that supports authoritarianism. But that branding of the Republican Party as the cowboy party, as the individual party, as the party of guys who can make it on their own was extraordinarily effective. And between 1981 and 2021, it moved more than $50 trillion from the bottom 90% to the top 1%. So I think you have to look at that as a pretty amazing branding moment. What would you do for the Democrats now?
Let me just say, I love this conversation. When people ask, what is the strategy of America? I would say if you had to distill it down to one very basic thing, since the 1980s, the strategy has been to cut taxes. That it's intoxicating to believe that the private sector, which is incredible in the United States, best private sector arguably in the world, that it's when it's unbridled and just let to run flat out, that it'll create so much prosperity, so much growth that will ultimately, quote unquote, trickle down. I think that it's just impossible, if you have any reverence for data, for numbers, and the pursuit of truth, to not acknowledge at this point that strategy has not worked. I would argue what you're calling the cowboy mentality is that we have embraced or conflated masculinity and strength with cruelty and coarseness. That there is a certain level of sensors being tickled by people who are so angry, felt like they've been so lied to, and that anger gets speedballed by algorithms that have a profit incentive in convincing us that your neighbor isn't a Russian soldier pouring across the Ukrainian border, or that your enemy isn't an Islamic Republic that is threatening, has a gender apartheid, or that your enemy isn't, climate change. Your enemy is the guy or gal next door that doesn't share your beliefs, and that you have every right to be angry at them. And that when these individuals see masked ICE agents putting their knees on the head of immigrants, that unfortunately, I think this is terrible, there are a lot of Americans that conflate that with leadership and strength. And that I'd love to lay this all at the feet of Republicans who are engaging in the slow burn towards fascism and are combine cruelty and stupidity, which adds up to depravity. But I'm worried, and I want to get your thought here, and then I'll answer the question about what I think the Democrats need to do. I worry that this represents a deeper sickness in American society, that Americans are so anxious, depressed, and angry that they are acting out, and they sort of appreciate or conflate this cruelty with strength and with leadership. And it represents a deeper sickness in our society that is going to be tougher to fix. Your thoughts?
Well, I agree with that. And the piece that you didn't mention is misogyny. I mean, a large part of this, that what you're talking about is dominance, is demonstrating dominance. And one of the ways it's been easiest to demonstrate dominance in the US since the 1980s is to dominate women. And that, I think, is way under talked about, because that the conflation of women's rights and the modern American government is, I think, terribly underexplored. Now, that being said, one of the things that I need to lay on the table, where I think you and I have a real confluence, is that I am an idealist, in that, as I said, what historians study is how and why societies change, and different people have different ideas about it. It could be the economy, or mass movements, or great men, or religion. I believe ideas change society. So, and everything is subordinate to that. Now, that's just my position. I'm not willing to go to the death for that. Well, against somebody who believes something else. But if that's the case, then what you are identifying, and I'm not going to disagree with you about that, is not a constant. It is something that has been created by a certain kind of language, which is how we communicate ideas, and by a certain kind of political system that encourages that sort of anger and hatred. Because I'm going to throw back at you here that if you actually look at polls on substance, not on things that are political, but if you look at how Americans feel about abortion rights, for example,
Yeah, they agree
or
with us.
common
They agree
sense,
with Democrats.
by a lot.
Yeah.
But the point is not that they agree with Democrats, but they agree with each other. And that disconnect between the American people and what they believe and what they want and what they are being fed by their, I would say, national rather than state leaders primarily, that seems to me to be the place that is the fulcrum for where we are and where those of us who want to change that really should be focusing. And that comes down to, I hate to say it, marketing.
We'll be right back after a quick break. Support for the show comes from LinkedIn. One of the hardest parts about moving to a new city is finding your people. You can look far and wide, but it's hard to find the people who just get you. And the same goes for B2B marketers. Locating the right people who align with your business and an audience that connects with your product and your mission can make all the difference. But instead of spending hours and hours scavenging social media feeds, you can just tap LinkedIn ads to reach the right professionals. According to LinkedIn, they have grown to a network of over 1 billion professionals, making it stand apart from other ad buys. You can target your buyers by job title, industry, company role, seniority, skills, and company revenue, giving you all of the professionals you need to reach in one place. So you can stop wasting budget on the wrong audience and start targeting the right professionals only on LinkedIn ads. LinkedIn will even give you a $100 credit on your next campaign so you can try it yourself. Just go to linkedin.com/Scott. That's linkedin.com/Scott. Terms and conditions apply, only on LinkedIn ads. Support for the show comes from ShipStation. You know how in sci-fi shows like Star Trek, the captain just has to tell the computer, tea, Earl Grey hot, and poof, it appears? That sounds nice, but since we're still stuck in the 21st century, we have to get our luxuries the old-fashioned way by ordering them online. And ShipStation is here to make that process easier and more seamless than ever before. ShipStation can help you automate some of the most tedious aspects of e-commerce for your small business at a fraction of the cost. ShipStation offers industry-leading, scalable features that help ensure accuracy and get your shipments out the door faster, so you can keep your customers happy with automated tracking updates and huge discounts off of UPS, DHL Express, USPS, and FedEx shipping rates. During the time of this spot, another 1,400 packages were shipped with the help of ShipStation. Upgrade to smoother shipping experience. Go to shipstation.com/ProfG to sign up for your free trial. No credit card or contract required, and you can cancel anytime. That's shipstation.com/ProfG. 2 weeks ago, I was asked to address what was called the Young Democratic Caucus, which is representatives in Congress under the age of 50. And I think it's hilarious and telling that they would identify any group as young if you're under the age of 50. And this was the entire topic. And I feel as if I'm kind of like, I don't know, Luke Skywalker and you're Yoda. So I want you to correct me and edit me where you think I get this wrong. But they said, how do we rebrand the Democratic Party? And I said that I think the three pillars are: one, restoring our alliances with our great trading partners and other democracies. And the notion that somehow we've been taken advantage of is insane. They sell us Mercedes at 5 points of gross margin, and they get 8 times EBITDA on it, or they get 40 cents in value. We sell them NVIDIA chips at 50 points of gross margin, of which get a 30 PE, so we get $15. Global trade and these unbelievable alliances pushing back on fascism in the middle of the 20th century, creating unbelievable prosperity, pushing back on Russia, pushing back on China, pushing back, promoting civil rights, women's rights. These alliances have been a reflection of what it means to be human, our advantage as a species, what it means to be mammal, and we need to restore alliances, most specifically in America, restore alliances between Republicans and Democrats, restore alliances between men and women. The genders have done an amazing job of convincing themselves that it's the other gender's fault. Young men believe that their descent is a function of women's ascent. Couldn't be more wrong. And that we need to restore the greatest alliance in history, and that men and women need to stop believing that it's the other gender's fault. Young men believe, a lot of women, unfortunately, I think, believe that men don't have problems. Young men don't have problems. They are the problem. I don't think that's productive either. The greatest alliance in history is the history between men and women. Men should celebrate, promote, and protect their daughters, their wives, other women. And women need to realize that their incredible progress, they will not continue to flourish if young men are floundering. So my first kind of touchstone or pillar is alliances and the importance of alliances and coming together. The second is inequality. You lose nothing above $10 million. There's no reason we shouldn't have a 60, 70% alternative minimum tax above $10 million. Daniel Kahneman and every psychologist has shown that above a certain amount of money, it brings you no incremental happiness. Restore corporate tax rates to a reasonable rate. Corporations are paying the lowest tax rates since 1929. Collect the taxes owed, the tax gap. It's not about tax rates, it's about the tax code. Reduce the deficit, lower interest rates, which will bring down our costs on our interest rate, restore fiscal responsibility. And then finally, something, and I may not have the right word here, but rather than calling it health, fitness. 70% of America is overweight or obese, places a huge burden on us economically in terms of a healthcare system, better lunch, better nutrition, put in place incentives that do away with food deserts, encourage the industrial food system to produce healthy food, and some alliances, addressing income inequality and becoming the fittest, strongest nation in the world, both mentally and physically. Those are kind of the three sort of policy pillars. But I am very open to coaching here because I was flying on instruments trying to tell these 50 or 60 representatives which messaging I think they need to embrace. Your thoughts?
So let me dig in a little bit to what you have suggested. When you are talking about fitness, one of the problems there, of course, is our transportation systems, and indeed what you're talking about with food deserts and the way food is distributed. One of the things about our food systems in the U.S. since World War II has been to provide as many calories as it is possible to provide as quickly as they can be provided, because that was the crisis that they were designed to address after the Depression. So we do have these perverse incentives set up in the way that we manage, for example, surpluses. But if you look at fitness, you're not, I think, talking just about muscles. You're talking about, once again, and I'm pushing you on this because this is kind of my American studies background. I think you were talking about, once again, celebrating working hard at something. That is, rather than simply having it, you work for it. So, being in good shape and caring about nutrition and cooking and so on, that takes work, that takes effort. And that's about more than physical fitness. And you mentioned in one word mental fitness, but I would suggest it also celebrates the idea that it's a positive good to invest work in something. And one of the things that really jumps out at me in this administration is the degree to which they sort of seem to say, well, we're elevating those people who would otherwise be elevated if we hadn't had to deal with civil rights initiatives, what they're calling DEI initiatives. And what that has done is we now have in place a bunch of people who have no freaking clue what they're doing. The idea that they should just have these positions rather than working their way really hard to get up to them. You look at somebody like Mark Milley versus Pete Hegseth, and Milley, is very, very, very well educated, works very hard at what he does, worked his way up. And then you have Hegseth, who came from the Fox News Channel. That idea of culturally, once again, celebrating hard work, education, um, the idea of taking control of your life, not by attacking your neighbor, but by investing in yourself. That's really very classic America that, if you think about it, was uppermost until at least the 1970s.
I started with something much more corny, and I started with the word love, and that is anything that gets in between two people being able to get married such that they can look after each other and have a rational passion for each other's well-being such that they don't end up on social services. Anything that inhibits a family's ability to take care of their children and creates so much economic stress that they're more likely than not to end up in a single-parent home. And I think you can reverse engineer a lot of single-parent homes to economic stress. Anything that gets in the way of people being in an ICU or an emergency room or being insured because they're of sexual orientation, but anything that gets in the way of a parent's ability to stay married, to have some dignity around their children, to not have medical debt such that they have to make a choice between food for their children and diabetes, but anything that gets in the way of this term love. And that kind of got laughed out of the room because they thought you're falling into the trap of the feminization of the Democratic brand, which they believe has not been helpful. But any thoughts around this notion of love or empathy being a touchstone for a political movement?
Yes, but I have to point out to you that what you have just done is you have modernized the concept of conservatism. What you are suggesting there echoes almost precisely what Edmund Burke was talking about during the French Revolution when he said that governments should not be concerned about ideologies because pretty soon leaders are busy trying to fit people into their ideologies rather than the other way around. What he said was that government should focus on stability because when you have a stable government and a stable society, there is less impetus to overturn it. And this is one of the reasons in his era, of course, he was interested in supporting aristocracy and the church and the family and so on. But that, what you just outlined, is a conservative, small c, and not Republican, and certainly not MAGA Republican, but a conservative.
Rockefeller Republican.
Hmm. That's right. Eisenhower Republican. Which just again, what you just outlined in this modern world sounds radical. It sounds like a radical left position. And this always, whenever anybody tells me I'm a leftist, I just laugh because quite literally, the policies that you are outlining and which now would be called wildly progressive were in fact Eisenhower values, and he was a Republican and not a conservative Republican, but certainly a center right, not center to center left. Um, so my thoughts are that first of all, that this is a conversation that really, really needs to be in the public sphere again, because it's just common sense, and it's something that again the nation was united around until there was a deliberate decision to divide the party, to divide people along party lines. I mean, the other thing that I find really interesting is during the Biden administration, there was a great deal of talk about how crime rates were plummeting. And I thought what was interesting about that is that even the members of the administration pointed to the increased police officers that in which they had invested in order to make those crime rates come down. But nobody that I read anyway, and I'm not a criminologist, but I did read around in this because I was very interested in it, looked at the fact that we had record low unemployment. People had jobs, and those jobs in the bottom 20% were paying a much greater rate than they had before Biden was in office. So you're looking at that and you're thinking, if you got money, you commit fewer crimes, which is sort of logical. So yeah, I mean, I'm not going to disagree with that at all in that concept, in your concept of fitness. In the concept of inequality, yeah, this is a no-brainer. People say, if I could be emperor, what would I do? And the answer is I would start with getting rid of the Bush tax cuts and the Trump tax cuts, and work on recreating the Great Compression that economists talk about, where there is less of a gap both in income and in wealth between the bottom of American society and the top of American society, not just for economic reasons, but because I think that does a whole heck of a lot more societally, when there is a less of a gap between people, less of an educational gap, less of a wealth gap, less of a cultural gap, and so on. And I agree with you also in terms of restoring alliances for sure. And it always jumps out at me, of course, that the United States was a driving factor in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And here we are, sending now people to a gulag in the Everglades. But what I would say is that these are really difficult concepts to put into a package that can win an election. I think people feel on vibes that these are right, but when I think about packaging, not the Democrats necessarily, because we're in this really interesting moment where the political parties are breaking down. Certainly the names may remain, but what the internals look like are going to be very different. And that's what I'm interested in, is watching these conversations take place all over the country among people who are not necessarily in elected office or aiming for elected office, where they are redefining what they would like America to be. One of the things that jumps out to me when you define America is less the idea of alliances or less the idea of love, and more the idea that what America has stood for historically is the idea that if you are willing to work hard, you can create a better life for yourself and your children. And everything flows from that. Now, the way that you talk about that, though, and again, that we have done historically, notably in the 1950s, 1940s, the 1930s, the late 1890s, early 2000 and aughts, and in the 1870s, and before that, is by saying, we're in this together. We are a community that works together and that we are not divided. And again, you used to see that in the 1940s, 1950s, and so on in movies, for example, in Superman, in Frank Sinatra's "The House Where I Live." Was it "The House Where I Live," the film about how he was dead set against religious discrimination in the United States. That is something that strikes me as being marketable, not least because you can plug into it our greatest moments in our history.
So, just along the lines of magic wand and being an emperor, some of the lowest levels of young adult and teen depression are in Israel, despite all the existential threats surrounding them, and amongst young Mormons. And the thing I find that's true among both those groups, and again, I might be backfilling a narrative here, is I think restoring mandatory national service. You talked about how people kind of saw themselves as Americans first before Republicans or Democrats, or maybe I'm putting words in your mouth, in the 60s or 70s. But I think a lot of that was because they'd served in the same uniform. What do you think of the idea of mandatory national service where Americans from different ethnic, demographic, and income and sexual orientation backgrounds could see each other? And I'm not just talking about the military. I'm talking about senior care, smoke jumpers, forest reclamation, whatever it might be. But you're going to spend 12 to 24 months working alongside a group of random Americans, realizing that you need to work in the agency of something bigger than yourself, and that thing is the United States.
100%. But I'm going to add a reason for that, and that is, of course, having come through a university system. In modern America, a lot of young people are not really ready to make adult decisions when they leave home. They need to spend time literally just learning how to live with other people or learning how to be on their own and managing, their schedules and crucially, figuring out what they want to do, which is
Especially
not.
boys. I'm going to be a sexist, especially boys. Do you have kids,
Mhm,
Professor?
3 of them.
Biologically, 18-year-old boys are 18 months behind their prefrontal cortex development. I have, when my 14 and 17-year-olds have friends over, the boys are dopes, and some of the girls look like they could be the junior senator from Pennsylvania. I think this would be especially important for young men. And it's easy to be sexist when you're favoring the female gender, but I really do think there is a marked difference between the maturity levels of boys coming out of high school and girls coming out of high school.
Well, and just the opportunity to work in different ways with different people would open up, I think, a lot of people to professions that they might not otherwise have considered. And that, I always think back on a student I had who was in college. I'm trying to be vague here, uh, because of his extraordinary sport ability and which was great, I'm sure. But he discovered his senior year that he was actually really, really good at history, is how he came across my screen. And he was just really starting to get it. And I said to we talked about this, and he really had gone to school to play sports. And he was planning to go back to work in construction where he had come from. And yet, had he had a couple of years, he might have discovered that he was as good as he was at history before he was graduating. And it always just kind of stuck with me that he's somebody who could have really benefited from a not a gap year, because it's gonna take people 6 months just to get their feet under them as it does in college, but a gap 2 years seems to me to be simply a no-brainer. Lots of other countries do it. My nephews who live in Europe did it, and, I would love to see that, both for the reasons you suggest, but also because developmentally it it just seems like it makes such good sense.
You were generous asking my thoughts on how to rebrand or brand the Democratic Party. I'll flip the question back to you. What do you think would be the right messaging or platform for Democrats?
So this is a little hard for me because, as I say, I don't really think in this moment as Republicans versus Democrats. I actually think in this moment
Well,
of
we
the
need
MAGA
your help more,
Republicans.
Professor. We're
Well,
up against the rope, and quite frankly, we're getting the shit kicked out of us. To the best of your ability, if you were channeling Democrats, what would you suggest is the real opportunity or white space for Democrats right now?
Okay, so where I was going with that is that I will tell you the branding that I would do, and it seems to me something the Democrats should jump on, but it's not saying, here's a party I want to market, because I think in this moment it's going to be important to recognize that the anti-MAGA party is not just Democrats, including in the way people think about certain issues. Some people still vote Republican because it is ingrained in them to have an R after their name, but they are in fact quite open to the idea of the kinds of things you and I are talking about. So here's what I would say. And my model is Abraham Lincoln, who was living through a very similar moment when two older parties were falling apart, and you had the rise of a reactionary right elite that was trying to get rid of American democracy and create a system in which the government answered only to them. And this is, of course, the elite enslavers who wanted to spread human enslavement across the American West. They're establishing slave states that could work with the southern slave states to get rid of free states all over the country. So what happened in that moment? And you have to remember here always that the people who could vote in the United States in that period were all white men, almost all of whom were virulently racist and didn't really care at all about Black rights. The way Lincoln managed to create a coalition that could restore American democracy was continually to go back to the Declaration of Independence and to say repeatedly, either we are all created equal or we are not. And if we are not, we need to tear up the Declaration of Independence. And when he did that, even in the southern parts of Illinois, for example, during the Lincoln-Douglas debates, even Democrats who were virulently racist would say, no, 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 that's what we stand for. And I think one of the things that is important to do in this moment is continually to highlight the principles on which people who live in the United States have stood on democracy and expanded democracy. And what is so exciting about that for someone like me is that while I just invoked Lincoln because he was very, very self-conscious about what he was doing, and often if I can't figure out how to address something, I will think, what would Lincoln have done? But in terms of principles. But if you think about someone like Fannie Lou Hamer or um, Dolores Huerta or Dr. Hector Garcia or Dr. King or, any of these people who were parts of marginalized populations used those concepts to expand rights in the United States and bring more people under the umbrella of the idea that they could have control over their destinies. And I think that's a touchstone that resonates with all American populations, and one that we have not taken sufficient advantage of in the years that we have really stopped teaching the real meat of American history. And I would argue that the popularity of the stuff I write is in part indicative of an extraordinary hunger for people to feel that they are part of that larger story of human self-determination and of the United States of America. I see more and more people now starting to do it, starting to talk about it, more politicians doing it. But I think that is crucial to building a mass movement that can overawe the kind of rising fascism that you're seeing among MAGA Republicans.
We'll be right back. Support for the show comes from SoFi Small Business Lending. You're a small business owner, you need capital to find new opportunities and grow, and you can do that with help from SoFi. You might know SoFi for student loans and high-interest savings, but now they help small businesses too. No more chasing bankers or wasting time in a branch. SoFi's Small Business Marketplace is your new go-to fast and digital solution. In one single simple search, SoFi matches you with vetted providers for your business in just minutes. You can discover options that meet your specific needs, and if you find a quote that works for you, you may receive funds as soon as the same day you're approved. Say it's working capital you need, or a line of credit, or an SBA loan, or equipment financing. SoFi's marketplace can help you find all of the above. It's already helped thousands of small businesses find the funding they need. SoFi also offers business owners curated tools, vetted business bank accounts, business credit card recommendations, and a ton of resources to help you scale your business like a boss. SoFi, now helping you get your business right. Visit SoFi.com/PropCheapPod and see your options in minutes. Support for Prof G comes from Vanta. Starting a company is incredibly gratifying, but can also be one of the hardest things you'll ever do. And one of the most challenging parts of it is making sure that you're meeting all the security compliance standards you need to meet. Vanta makes the whole process easier. Vanta is a trust management platform that helps businesses automate security and compliance, enabling them to demonstrate strong security practices and scale. That means that a whole bunch of tasks that used to be expensive, time-consuming, and complex can now be automated and streamlined. Simply put, your company can't grow if it can't prove that it's meeting security standards, including SOC 2, ISO 27001, and HIPAA. Vanta can get you audit-ready in weeks instead of months, saving you up to 85% of associated costs. And Vanta scales with your business, helping you continuously monitor compliance, unify risk management, and streamline security reviews all in one place. Starting a business is hard. Let Vanta make the process a little bit easier. Go to vanta.com/ProfG to meet with a Vanta expert about your business needs. That's vanta.com/ProfG. We're back with more from Heather Cox Richardson. So let's bring it to present day. You've called Trump's mega bill the capstone of MAGA's 6-month transformation of the U.S. government. Do you think we're witnessing the cementing of illiberalism? And you've also said this was sort of the signature Republican legislation of this millennium thus far. Your thoughts?
Well, I will answer that, but let me ask you, what do you think of that budget reconciliation bill?
I think it's the largest transfer of wealth in history from the future to the past, from the poor to the rich, from the young to the old. I think it has, not to be too dramatic here, but when I look at my success, Professor, it's built on these pillars of access to family planning for my mother, assisted lunch programs when I was in elementary school, access to deep pools of capital to start companies based on rule of law, access to wonderful, talented immigrants who built my companies. The fact that my mother was able to survive in Britain, sleeping as a 4-year-old Jew in a bomb shelter, that America decided to convert its car factories to tank factories to push back on fascism. I'm so personally, quite frankly, and you can probably hear the emotion in my voice, just so rattled by this, because I feel it is setting on fire all the pillars of my prosperity and success. So, not a fan.
Well, and that, I think, is what I was getting at with the idea that this was the capstone of the past 6 years. It's also the capstone in many ways of the Republican project since Reagan, which is to blow up the social safety net. But it's not, when I call it a capstone in part because, of course, that's what the Department of Government Efficiency was also designed to do. And that the idea of the rescissions, the clawing back of the money that has already been appropriated, the impoundments, and so on. The idea is to shred the modern American state. But what interests me, it's the wrong way to put it. What is replacing it, as I say, is the idea that somehow we're going to go back to a better past, which, by the way, is a very fascist concept. But there doesn't seem to be any real idea of what that looks like. So, for example, these Trump tariffs, the idea that this is suddenly going to make everybody rich is just a complete fantasy. It is a complete fantasy. Or the fact that Brooke Rollins, the head of U.S. Of the Agriculture Department today, said that when we get rid of the undocumented immigrants who are actually working in the agricultural field, that we can simply replace them with the people who are on Medicaid. Um, that's just such a far-fetched image of what the future could look like in a country that has, since the very development of Western agriculture in the 1880s and 1890s, depended on migrant labor. I mean, there's nothing on the other side that suggests the survival of American democracy. And so I think what you're looking at is the rise, as I say, of authoritarianism, one guy to run everything. But as we're looking at that, and as I alluded to earlier, will 334 million Americans say, "Oh, I was conned, it's okay"? or will they say, this is not the country I wanted? And this is one of the reasons that conservatism developed, actually, to go back to that theme, because what they are creating is extraordinary instability, just extraordinary instability. And of course, with that bill, we now have a massively expanded ICE and Border Patrol system that is, in fact, a standing army in the US, a militarized state in the US. But is that going to be enough to maintain a dictator or a quasi dictator from the MAGA wing in power going forward? I think I have too much faith in the American people to believe that's going to be the case. What do you think?
Well, I'm a bit of a catastrophist and a glass half empty kind of guy, as you probably figured out. So I immediately draw conclusions or parallels with the Gestapo. That was 32,000 people. I think ICE is 22. They spent 2 billion. We're spending 12 billion. It was meant to be an administrative body focusing on documentation and border forms. And instead it's turned into what as far as I can tell, is a series of pageantry and fear meant to exhibit strength and also scare people. And my father always used to say to me when I would compare Trump to Hitler, you got to keep in mind, Scott, Trump had his own private army. And as far as I can tell, ICE is a private army for the current administration. So I find it frightening. And when I think of just taking out the moral argument and the historical parallels, the notion somehow that we need to get rid of these immigrants such that more Americans have better jobs and higher paid wages, and it's just so stupid. Imagine the millions of immigrants pouring over the border right now. It's called AI. AI is a much bigger threat to people's livelihoods than the person taking care of your aging mother or serving, or working at the Chick-fil-A. And the notion somehow that American wages are going to go up, all that's going to happen is our expenses are going to go up. And what I find most telling about these raids is they're raiding Home Depot, churches, and schools. And maybe that's an indication that these are the kind of people we want here. And then just being very unemotional about it. Immigration, people are often very comfortable saying immigration is the lifeblood of our success. What I don't think they're in touch with is that the most profitable part of immigration has been undocumented immigration, because they're a flexible workforce that pays taxes and then doesn't stick around for social services and melts back sometimes to their original host country when the crops are picked or that work dries up. And the reason why we have put up with this or tolerated it is because we recognize it's an incredible economic advantage to have this flexible workforce. So, again, I go back to Germany, the demonization of immigrants. It economically makes no sense. It's morally reprehensible. And I am uncomfortable with a private army, an army that will have a greater funding budget than at the FBI, who is responsible for white-collar crimes and terrorism. We've decided to allocate more resources to a private army of people who have to wear masks. They're not only wearing a certain color shirt or insignias as armbands, they're wearing masks because of what they're doing is so, in my view, un-American. So I find ICE another, incredibly disturbing. Your thoughts?
I agree. I totally agree with that. Well, my point was just I'm not entirely sure that in a country of this size, they are going to be able to get the kind of control that somebody could in a smaller country like Germany was in 1933. So, I think you're right that this is pageantry, that a lot of it so far is pageantry designed, first of all, to terrorize immigrants, but also to terrorize other Americans into not speaking up. And that's the piece that I am not convinced is necessarily going to work. And by the way, I didn't mean in any way to downplay the terror and the damage and the torture even that immigrants and migrants are going through in this. I'm trying to look at the larger picture here and what the Trump administration is trying to do. So I don't disagree with you at all on that, but I'm just saying I'm not entirely sure it's going to work. This is an extraordinarily unstable administration. Trump himself is not in good shape. J.D. Vance, the heir apparent, commands no real voting base. Increasingly, the wheels are coming off the bus as FEMA can't respond to things, as the tariffs are starting to kick in, as prices are going up. It is. I guess what I keep saying is I think we're going into a period of extraordinary instability. And I am not convinced that the outcome of that is going to be a dictatorship. It could just as easily be that the outcome of it is a renewed American democracy, but it's going to be messy, messy, messy either way.
I always jokingly say in my companies, there's been all these people that are kind of invisible until they fuck up. And that is the person running the accounting, the person running the events, that they're not appreciated until something goes wrong. And I feel that a lot of Americans are coming to grips with the fact that there's a lot of people, hydrologists, meteorologists, the TSA, working who are invisible until there's a disaster. And that some of this long-term thinking and investment in boring jobs are actually really important. And that they're going to learn very painfully that these things matter, and that immigrants play a key role, and that an autocracy is strong. I love your vision. I'm worried that this is the first step towards a darker period where we have a lot of young men who are struggling, don't have a lot of economic or romantic prospects, are looking for scapegoats to justify their problems, and that we're one economic shock away from an authoritarian government that gets even uglier. And we already have, you called it a gulag. I call them concentration camps. Concentration camps, one of the definitions is a camp outside of the host territory such that the individuals shipped to these places don't have the rights they would in their own domestic environment. We're already there. We have demonization of immigrants. We have militarization of civil agencies. We have a disrespect for some of the institutions. They always attack the academics. Why? Because you and you're what I'd call a hardcore, real, legitimate academic. I'm sort of showing up and doing a rich little version of academics, and that is I teach. But you, quite frankly, you just have much deeper domain expertise than me. And I find that common across all moves towards fascism is to attack universities. Why? Because at the end of the day, you especially, but also I'll include myself in this crowd, we teach young people to ask why. And they don't want young people and intelligent people asking why. They want them feeling things. And so I worry that there's a fork in the road here, but one potential left turn here could be much darker. And I look back at Germany again in the 30s, an incredibly progressive society, pro-gay, civil rights, appreciation for immigrants, appreciation for academics, and then a descent into darkness. And I worry that that same opportunity for darkness is available to us. And then everyone talks about institutions, the courts, the universities. And what I like about what you're saying is it's beyond institutions, it's people. It's the judges got to stand up. Academics got to be fearless, such as you have been, and smart and thoughtful. People, employers have to stand up for their employees. I'm very disappointed in the technology community. Some of the people I hang out with who are incredibly blessed, not speaking up about their blessings, that we keep talking about institutions under attack. I think that's true. What I find so disappointing about this, Professor, is that not more people are speaking up. When you have billionaire owners of media companies paying off the administration under the threat of a legal case that they would win, when you have legal firms saying we will provide, basically bending a knee and ignoring all the principles of our basic judicial system, I worry that not as enough individuals are standing up. Because at the end of the day, these institutions are made up of people. So I'm more worried about a darker fork in the road here.
Well, I'm worried about that darker fork in the road, but I also recognize that there is no way forward except doing it. There's no way through but going forward. And so one of the things I'm trying to do is find a way to get people on the brighter path rather than the darker path. Because, the thing is, as a historian, we know how this plays out. We know exactly how this plays out. And one of the things that just gobsmacks me is that knowing what we know and how these situations play out, that people in the administration would be trying it yet again, and people would be getting behind them. Because again, I can write that script. I really can write that script. But I can also write the other script in which people reject that version of our future and pick a different one. And that's the one that I'm working for. I do have a question for you. You mentioned something a second ago that sparked an idea for me that I would love to hear you expand on a little bit more. I have been sitting here looking at the reduced numbers of undocumented and documented migrants in the United States and saying to myself, where are they going to find ways to replace them? And I'm looking at child labor, for example, or now this idea that people on Medicaid are going to have to work in the fields or whatever. Do you think that what they are doing, but the administration, to be clear, is doing, is recognizing that AI is going to wipe out a ton of jobs and setting up the idea that those jobs are not the fault of those people pushing AI, which is a problematic, and maybe someday we can talk about what AI entails for the United States. But that rather than saying this billionaire puts you out of business, they're trying to convince a lot of people who will be unemployed that their problem is the gardener or is the woman doing healthcare. Is that, do you think, a deliberate sleight of hand?
For me, the logic just isn't sequential or doesn't add up because the people they're going after are exactly the kinds of jobs that AI, some of the few sectors that AI can't replace. AI still hasn't figured out a way to, wake your grandmother up and bring her medication. AI still can't give you physical therapy. AI still can't, you still need people on construction sites. You still need people harvesting crops. I just don't, AI could potentially replace a lot of Uber drivers and a lot of truck drivers, but what I see is that who AI is replacing is my kids. When I say my kids, my second year MBA graduates, my first job out of college was at Morgan Stanley as an analyst. They hired 80 analysts. I'm convinced all the work I did in 2 years in fixed income as an analyst at Morgan Stanley could be done in about 6 weeks now with AI. If they really wanted, I see the presidency as just a capital allocator, and that his job is to, or her job is to allocate capital to a greater return than another leader who has capital at their disposal. And taking $12 billion to round up immigrants who are taxpayers and, during the day at work and on weekends and evenings at school and at church, that makes no sense to me. If you really were concerned about employment, you'd be deploying vocational programs and more critical thinking skills such that people could embrace these new technologies and also embrace more self-sufficiency in energy and shovel-ready jobs. I mean, we need more healthcare workers, more people who understand how to install energy-efficient HVAC computers, build nuclear power plants. I mean, that to me is where you would help with the employment picture. But I want you to just touch on one thing that's very close to my heart, and that is I work, I think a lot about technology. And something that's just so extraordinarily disappointing to me is that these are the most blessed people in the world, as far as I can tell. If you look at the majority of them, there's absolutely some great stories of immigrants and people pulling themselves by their bootstraps. 20% of the NASDAQ is not only immigrants by market cap, it's Indian immigrants. And there's some wonderful stories. But a lot of these kids came from privileged backgrounds, whether it was Bill Gates or Mark Zuckerberg. They dropped out of Harvard because they could. And they got into Harvard because they could. And yet it feels like the most blessed among us, specifically these tech billionaires, are the first ones, quite frankly, to shitpost America and talk about some weird techno-libertarian vision that makes absolutely no sense to me. And a lot of people draw conclusions with the Gilded Age. And I know you've looked at the Gilded Age, and I would just love to get your thoughts on the parallels between the Gilded Age and kind of this technotopia, or whatever you'd want to call it, and what we can learn from it, and where you think it goes from here.
I'm actually really glad you asked that because I think a lot about that, including in the ideology of the modern day tech people, because of the parallels it has with the 1880s and 1890s, especially because things were changing by the actual turn of the century. Um, what I think happens is that people begin to internalize their belief that they are better than other people, that they have done something extraordinarily clever. And often, I just want to add this here, I will follow that thought, but often there is a generational change inherent there. That is, the first generation will say it, but not really mean it. They're saying it either to pump themselves up or for political advantage. But their sons, because it's almost always sons, actually believe it. So in the 1890s, for example, you see coming out of the Civil War, a whole bunch of people in the American South talking about how Black Americans are inherently not as able as white Americans, as Euro Americans, and therefore they should not have a say in American society. They used it really as a political argument for that first generation. The second generation believes that they are better, that white men are better than Black men, and certainly than other Black people, and they are willing to enforce that through lynching. So that generational shift really matters. But that being said, I do think there is this idea that as people succeed and as they spend time with other people who succeed, they start to believe that they are, in fact, better than other people. And they, especially men, tend to erase the reality of how they got to be where they are. And they set out to create a system that they think advantages them in such a way that they will do good for the most people. So instead of picking up right there on Peter Thiel or Elon Musk, where I'll get in a second, Andrew Carnegie is a really useful person to look at because he's an immigrant who becomes a steel baron, and arrives in the United States at a time when he is able to rise because of the economy, because of the Civil War and the nationalization of that period, because of his connections and so on. And by the 1890s, he is no longer talking about, the fortune of America that enabled him to become who he was. He is talking about how it was his own hard work that enabled him to become who he was, and that because he was so much better than the people around him, he should be able to concentrate wealth in his own hands, and that's the way the society really should work, is that wealth should concentrate among those most able to amass it, because what they would do was they would use it as the stewards of society by building libraries or opera houses or public facilities that could not be achieved unless they did concentrate that wealth, because if you left it in the hands of the workers, they would waste it on food or clothing or housing or leisure time. Well, if you move that mindset into the present, you can see somebody like Elon Musk, who believes that he will save humanity, or at least alleges he believes that he will save humanity by settling Mars. Um, you see that same idea that he has ideas that are only being corrupted by the idea of civil rights, regulations, the idea that, in fact, women and people of color should have equal rights to employment and equal protections in American society. That hampers him. And that mindset that some people are better than others and have the right to rule for the good of humanity is a thread that runs through American history, not just from the Gilded Age, but the elite and Southern enslavers said the same thing in the 1850s, the exact same thing in the 1850s, that they were the ones who had truly figured out society. So to me, it's just a continuity. And that in many ways helps me think about ways to combat it, because I don't believe that. I actually do believe that people are equal and that they do have a right to a say in their government, and they do have a right to be treated equally before the law. And they should have equal access to resources, including things like healthcare and education. So when I think about reinforcing that set of ideological principles, which are the same ones that somebody like Theodore Roosevelt or Dwight Eisenhower or FDR or Lincoln embraced, um, in a way, there's a roadmap there to see how we have succeeded in the past. And I do want to point out that in all of those moments that I just mentioned, the 1850s, the 1890s, the 1920s, the present, it didn't look at the time as if the idea of equality was going to win. You think of somebody like John Dos Passos and his poem about how they have clubbed us off the streets. Um, People thought that the rich elites who wanted to control everything were going to win. It was never an easy fight. And this fight is not going to be easy either, but I am not ready to give up on America. We have done it in the past, and in a way, we have the tools to know how to do it again.
Not ready to give up on America. Heather Cox Richardson is a professor of history at Boston College and an expert on American political and economic history. She is the author of 7 award-winning books, including her latest, Democracy Awakening, Notes on the State of America. Her widely read newsletter, Letters from an American, synthesizes history and modern political issues. I'm going to ask a favor. Most conversations I have, I think I have a certain, I'm not proud of this, level of arrogance. I think, okay, that's interesting, but I have a better take on this. I found myself insecure in this conversation because you are so forceful and dignified and have such deep domain expertise. And this is my ask. I want to bring more light to your work. I think it just shocks me that you are as good as much praise and influence as you have, that I think your work deserves a lot more attention. And with your approval and your help, I would like to bring more attention to it. I can't tell you how much I enjoyed this conversation. I think you are doing great work and are the right voice at the right moment.
Thanks.